Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? Welcome to the April Lunch and Learn. It's good to see everybody. Looks like we've got a robust number of people out there in cyberspace too, which is great. Before we get started, it is Food Truck Friday. Today, the Carne Somos Grill, David's Dogs, and the Fat Cat Cupcakes are right over here on Dunlap Street from 11 to 2. If you want to grab some lunch afterward. Next month, May, we've got David Dangerfield. David teaches history on our Salkehatchie campus. He's going to give a lecture on Shades of Gray, non-white Confederate soldiers. That's on the 26th at noon. Hopefully you'll come out for that. I'm pleased today to introduce my colleague and friend, Pat Lawrence. Dr. Lawrence is an associate professor. He teaches English on our campus. And as you might be aware, we've had a whole host over the years of our English faculty doing lunch and learns. Chris Bundrick sitting there has done one, Stephen, Crispo, Claudia Hyman, Priest, Amy Gerald in March. And so great opportunity to introduce another one. Besides teaching classes, Pat is also the director of our Academic Success Center that helps students with tutoring. It's on the second floor of Medford Library, and he brings his passion from the classroom into helping the students with that. He's really interested and has been writing on censorship, controversies, and American political and social movements. He's primarily interested in the 20th century literature of the U.S. and literary theory. He's currently co-editing a collection of essays about the impact of obscenity discourses on comics, history, and theory. He'll be talking today and has copies for sale if anybody is interested in his latest book, Obscene Gestures, Counter-Narratives of Sex and Race in the 20th Century. He's been published in Mosaic, Asian American Literature Discourses and Pedagogies, and Intertexts and collections from Cambridge University Press, University Press of Mississippi, and the Utah University Press. Without further ado, Pat Lawrence.
I don't know if I was exactly ready. I feel like we need more ado. Can I shrink the window? Is that going to work for us? Okay. All right, great.
Not up there, though. You might have to share your screen.
Let me make sure I'm sharing. I think that's right. Better. There we go. Okay. Great. Cool. Let me say, before I get going, thank you everybody for coming here. I know some of you were extraordinarily busy. I can only imagine here at the end of the semester, most of us are. And then the rest of you, thank you for making time to come in here, talk about these things that fascinate me, that I get probably too deeply involved in, but that I find important on some level. And hopefully I'll be able to impress upon you that importance as well. This talk in particular is really exciting for me because when I first came to USCL in 2016, I met Brent Bergen then, and he said, we were, on one offhand occasion, he said, we got to get you in there for one of our lunch and learns. And I thought, that's awesome. Yes, let's absolutely do that, because to me, this has always kind of been like a marquee event from USCL, and I was always excited to be here. The problem was that I really respected that the events showcased local connections, research that the university was doing that was connected somehow to the work, to the community. And my work tends to have a national focus. I look at obscenity controversies across the country, and then I correlate those with the different political movements that are happening at the time and with the different ways that those controversies can play out. That tends to have a national flavor, but I was always excited to dig a little bit deeper. So I started writing the book and revising the research and doing all this other stuff. The book eventually came out in June of 2022, so it's just about a year. This is it here. It came out, and it turns out that I have this fourth chapter that deals with the 1980s and 90s that really zeroes in on the controversy over Tony Kushner's Angels in America in Charlotte in the 1990s. And so I wanted to take this as an opportunity to dig deeper into that and to look at its more local ramifications. And that's what I want to present to you today. So what I will present today is kind of a mixture of what's in the book, and then new, never before seen footage that is only for you all and I guess the online audience. But I'm excited to get into it. I also know that many of you will have experience or memory of this incident as well. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it, and a little bit mortified that I'm going to say something that it does not accord with your memory at all. Because while I was alive in 1992 when all this happened in Charlotte, I didn't live in the region then. So this is sort of a new interest to me, and I'm excited to share it with you. Here's what I'll go over in the talk. First, I will share some of the big principles in the book. So defining what obscenity is and how it relates to our free speech principles in the United States and our long tradition of that. And then I will get a little bit into a case study that shows one of the big ideas I put forward in the book. And then I'll turn to the Charlotte incident to see if we can draw some new conclusions from that. Cool, let's do it. I want to use a clicker because I got a little bit over dramatic with animations. You're welcome. It's going to be great. Ah, come on. You know you want to. Oh, I'm actually not able. I'm not able to advance slides. Give me just a second, everybody. There we go. Let's see if we can get there now. I'm going to share again. Money. Yes. All right. So here's where I want to start. One is to kind of ease into the notion of literary obscenity. What is it? Why would a person spend 15 years of their life thinking and talking about it? So in part, sorry, I advanced too fast. I got clicker happy. Literary obscenity is in part a history, a literary history. Obscenity tracks with literary history. So I'll give you some examples. So we have Fanny Hill by John Cleland, a famous novel that was prosecuted. Everything that I show you here in the next few slides was actually prosecuted for obscenity. These are books that were taken off the shelves, booksellers were arrested, publishers had their stores impounded, etc. So Fanny Hill by John Cleland, Ulysses by James Joyce, which we consider to be a monument of international literature, of Irish literature particularly. D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, very popular right now, including a film adaptation of that. It's not the first film adaptation. And of course, D.H. Lawrence is a very popular and famous English author with a great last name. And then Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which we consider to be a touchstone text of the American counterculture in the 1950s. Copies of this were taken off the shelves in San Francisco. The publisher was prosecuted in a very famous case called People of California versus Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And then, of course, Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it is considered a very influential book, also made into a movie, also prosecuted. So literary history is in part a history of obscenity, and there are all sorts of reasons for this. Of course, the controversy drew attention to these books, and the long legal history of defenses against those charges also brought the books to prominence and generated a ton of studies and attention. So that's part of it. I'll talk about it in a little bit. But that's how, this is just one way of looking at the literary tradition, especially in the United States and Europe. In the book, I study that with respect to these several books. So in Obscene Gestures, I'm interested in Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller. He's an American. This was published in France in the 1930s, was not available in the United States for about 20 years until it was imported, then impounded, then prosecuted all the way to the Supreme Court before being declared not obscene. Native Son, the first book ever published by the first book by an African-American ever published by the Book of the Month Club, but they required abridgment of the text to remove some of its more controversial content. Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Of course, Toni Morrison, one of America's Nobel laureates and a leading light in American letters. The Bluest Eye, perennially challenged in part because it is on the Common Core reading list for 11th graders. Gravity's Rainbow, which nobody ever reads, the less said, the better. Color Purple by Alice Walker, of course, part of a Hollywood film starring Oprah Winfrey and others, a major text, but also routinely challenged for some of its problematic and difficult depictions. Blood and Guts in High School, which nobody reads and which is incredibly obscure, but also was challenged at the time. You still can't buy it in Germany, I think, or Australia. And then the one that I'm most interested in here today, Angels in America by Tony Kushner. A Pulitzer Prize winning play from the 1990s that caused a pretty big stir in Charlotte that lasted, has still some ramifications today. So let's talk about what obscenity is. Most people think that I mean giving the finger, but I don't mean that when I say obscene gestures. And actually, obscenity is often used in these very loose ways. Sometimes we think of obscenity simply as anything that challenges modesty or propriety or decency, particularly by doing something to excess. But from a legal standpoint, that's not what it is. That's only one, that's a broader understanding of it. Let's talk a little bit about what it is. Okay. So, of course, in the United States, we have the First Amendment. This is part of our tradition. You all are familiar with this. I'm going to start with this because it is well known and because it's fairly straightforward. The First Amendment, applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment, states in part, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. This is in addition to separation of church and state, right? The Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, and then that last little bit that says we have the right to protest. The part that I'm interested in here is that very unequivocal language, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. In theory, this means that in the United States, we have nearly infinite protection to say whatever you want in every situation. Now, the funny thing, of course, is that the Supreme Court justices do not think that that unequivocal language is unequivocal. They actually say that while the fundamental freedoms of speech and press have contributed greatly to the development and well-being of our society, implicit in the history of the First Amendment is the rejection of obscenity as utterly without redeeming social importance. You can say whatever you want, but not obscenity. That's off limits. There are a couple of other things. The jurisprudence over the last 100 years or so has generally accepted that there are a handful of things the First Amendment does not protect. There are exceptions to the First Amendment, and they include things like the clear and present danger test. It's more than a Harrison Ford movie, and then obscenity, and sometimes we think of the fighting words doctrine, so you can't provoke someone into violence. Okay, so which of these categories is obscenity? Right now, we're working with the 1973 precedent on obscenity that defines it. That there were dozens of rulings in the 1950s and 60s to try to define what obscenity was. There was a history going back into the 1870s and 80s, and then further back in English common law. Pretty much everybody accepted that obscenity, you could definitely ban it. You could definitely abridge that freedom of speech, but it was hard to declare exactly what that was. So we had a bunch of court battles that defined what this is that you can't say. And we now are working with this test from 1973 by the Berger Court, considered a more conservative court than the Warren Court that was involved in a lot of the rulings before. You would know the Warren Court from cases like Miranda v. Arizona, from which we get the Miranda warning for the accused, Loving v. Virginia, Brown v. Board of Education. So famous rulings. And then the Berger Court, mostly a result of Richard Nixon's 4 appointments to the Supreme Court, then walked back many of those. This is a sort of compromise ruling. So it establishes 3 main principles for what is considered obscenity. What can you legally ban? And this is the category. First, the work has to appeal to the prurient interest, which basically means it has to be intended to arouse the audience. The next is it has to be patently offensive. It has to be not just distasteful, not even just indecent, but patently offensive. Everybody has to agree. This is completely beyond the pale. And then the last one is it lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. You can do these things as long as you're artsy about it, is basically the protection that you've got. Now, there's some nuance in this. Trust me, I am so happy to talk about like minute changes in the language of these rulings. If you have questions about it, let's do it. I won't bore you with it now, but I do want to point out a couple of things. There's a lot of wiggle room in here. First, appeals to the prurient interest. Well, does that mean the author's intent was to do this? Or does the work appeal to the prurient interest of the reader? Who is it that's at the root of that? And then second, it has to be patently offensive. Well, that's a matter of taste. Patently suggests that like everybody will agree, but everybody doesn't ever agree. So what's offensive varies widely regionally and in time, over time. And then the last one is the most wiggliest of all. It has to lack serious artistic, political, or scientific value. It's not just that it has to have that value somewhere, but it has to be serious. And serious is a subjective term. So there's a lot of wiggle room in here, which means that while we have robust First Amendment free speech protections in the United States, prosecutions absolutely still happen. Obscenity prosecutions happen not frequently, but often. And then there's also this gap between the legal definition of obscenity and popular understandings of obscenity, which produces controversies even when a work isn't prosecuted. So people may say, I don't like this book, I think it shouldn't be available, but at the same time, maybe they're not having the booksellers prosecuted for it. So it still produces quite a bit of controversy today. Let's talk about what it looks like when those things happen. So usually we assume that people who would like to restrict access to a text for one reason or another have some version of this censorious intent. They'd like to take a book and silence it. They'd like to take it away from its audience, or they would like to restrict that audience through things like abridging content, changing it, removing the scenes that are most offensive or problematic, or removing books from libraries, or putting them in special sections of the libraries, or requiring some sort of intermediary process, parental approval, for example, for school libraries. Pressuring theaters to cancel performances or showings. That sometimes this is film, sometimes it is theater performances, drama. Striking books from school curriculums. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye is often challenged. Maybe we shouldn't assign it to 11th graders. It's quite difficult. So people suggest alternative books, for example. And then in theory, limiting sales. We assume people who are challenging books hope people won't buy and read this book. But these things are not what happen. What usually happens is a different kind of narrative. And I lay this out in the book. And each chapter lays out a different scenario in which this happened multiple times, going all the way back to the 1930s and going through the 1990s. So the history of obscenity controversies looks more like this. You attempt to restrict the book, and that drives media attention. Sometimes it's national media, sometimes it's local media, but the resulting public interest then actually leads to increased sales. It's actually pretty reliable. And if you think back to a lot of the salacious music controversies, you'll realize that marketing agencies know this perfectly well. Create a little bit of controversy, and you're going to increase your sales. And so people push the envelope specifically for this reason. From a historical, from a legal standpoint, what's interesting to me and other scholars is this part of it, which is that when this happens, a wealth of texts are produced. So in order to defend a book in court against a charge of obscenity, remember that you have to find it to be artistically valuable. That means you have to go get an expert, somebody who knows something, a literary expert, for example, and then you have to bring them into court and they have to testify what's in the book and why is it important and what's it doing. Literary analysis as legal testimony happens all throughout these cases. And then also, of course, the news media is all over it. Legal scholars are debating, exactly where this falls on the spectrum of what's allowable and what's not. So actually that often leads to canonization. I have read the books I was showing you before. They're not all great. Some of them are just like kind of okay, but they become so important as historical artifacts that they nonetheless are led to canonization. And that's the last point here, because they are artifacts of their moment, important social and historical phenomena. Libraries actually need to own them. People are interested in them. They're important as a representation of what was going on. So often the opposite happens. Now, you might think then that we could think of censorship as a kind of reverse psychology. When we attempt to censor something, we actually get more of it. We don't silence it. We create a lot of noise around it. So Michel Foucault wrote a book called The History of Sexuality. It's pretty influential, of course. I won't belabor it. But he says he's writing about the Victorian period, during which we think of as generally a restrictive period, a time of modesty. And he says, censorship of sex, there was installed rather an apparatus for producing an ever greater quantity of discourse about sex. That is, when we say that you should be modest, every time we have that conversation, what we're talking about is sex. Every time we say we should not talk about sex, we're talking about how to restrain ourselves and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. All of those conversations actually proliferate. And it's at this time that Foucault is talking about that we get psychoanalysis, therapy as discussion of your sexual history. So actually, we produce a huge amount of discourse when we try to suppress something, because we got to talk about why we're suppressing it and whether it's the right idea and how much and whatever. That tracks with the history of obscenity and challenging books as well. A censorship, for example, of James Joyce's Ulysses, no, we're still talking about it 100 years later. A censorship of genderqueer, the #1 most challenged book on the American Library Association's book of challenged books this year and last, is also #1 in memoirs on Amazon.com. But it wasn't before it got challenged. We create a huge wealth of attention for these books. But you might think, therefore, like everybody should rush out and get their book censored or push the envelope. But the reality is also that this doesn't always work out perfectly for everybody. And this is an excerpt from the book where I say discourse is not always incited equally. The discourses incited by the transgressions of dominant voice authors tend to elevate their status in the realms of politics and philosophy, while the discourses incited by the transgressions of marginalized people tend to justify their status in the realms of pathology and criminality. So if you're someone like Henry Miller, you're writing from a relatively comfortable position in American society, and you break the rules, you come across as a rebel. You're cool, right? You're pushing the envelope. You have seen the future and imagined it beyond our restrictive contemporary society. But if you're someone like Toni Morrison, if you're someone like Alice Walker, if you're someone like Maya Kobabe, and you break the rules, you tend to be viewed as a demonstration of the stereotypes applied to your culture. You break the rules and you confirm what everybody already thought, which is, you're indecent or you're inappropriate or whatever. So this is a division that plays out in the 4 chapters. So each chapter, remember I told you, I trace that first part of the narrative, and then I show how the paths diverge. Some people are allotted some possibilities, other people allotted other possibilities. And I'll give you a quick example. This, I want you to keep in mind, discourse is almost always incited, but not always equally. Let me show you how it plays out. I want to talk about Lenny Bruce and Belle Barth, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most people are familiar with Lenny Bruce and not Belle Barth. Right, there's a reason for that, which is what I've been sort of talking about, right? We know Lenny Bruce looking super cool here, right? Over his shoulder, cigarette hanging out of his mouth. He lived from 1925 to 1966, so sort of early to middle part of the 20th century. Memorialized in popular culture in the sense that there was a play made about his life, and I think a movie, and he's on like Rolling Stone's, greatest comedians of the 20th century. He's like #2 after, I don't know, Richard Pryor or something. And then he was also prosecuted for obscenity a lot of times and died poor in part because of it, despite being wildly popular in the moment. And then he was eventually pardoned in 2003 posthumously. And here's Belle Barth. Same time frame, right? 1911 to 1971. Also, there's a play about her life. Also, she was prosecuted for obscenity multiple times. She actually, in some ways, was in her moment more popular than Lenny Bruce. She had a Vegas residency. She was a huge deal. She actually started on the Borscht Belt, which is a Jewish comedy circuit in the Catskills, but then branched out and was doing shows in Miami and Vegas and Chicago. Huge deal historically. She's the one you don't know about. Why? Because the reception plays out differently. So if we talk about Bruce's impact, talk about his dangerous style, right? So Deborah Ahrens and Mark Mierowski, who I'm not putting on blast here, I just use them as representative of a larger trend. They say Lenny Bruce took himself seriously as a prophet and teacher. He transformed stand-up comedy, shaping it as aggressively pointed social critique. And it is in this respect that he can be considered to belong to the tradition of the great moralists. Well, check out what they say about him, right? He's a prophet, he's a teacher, he's transformational, social criticism, great moralists, right? This is a guy who would get on stage and tell potty jokes for 20 minutes or a half hour, right? But he's viewed as socially transformative. Whereas Barth, from the same article, strictly speaking, it might be argued that Belle Barth and Pearl Williams, whom I'm not speaking about here, were not stand-up comedians in the same tradition, but rather entertainers who perform particular identities, creating a seductive and warm club-like atmosphere different and less dangerous than using only a microphone on a bare stage. Look at the difference in the way that they're characterized. They're not even comedians. They're just entertainers, making people happy, but nothing important here. It's not dangerous, right? It's not even in the vein of Lenny Bruce. And this is the kind of divergence that we see play out, that the possibilities are different. Breaking the rules can be super cool. I'm definitely an example of it. But sometimes it gets you into trouble, and it depends on what's possible for you. All right. That's a national trend. It plays out pretty reliably, but there's a lot of complexity to it. So if you're interested in digging into how that actually works, I'm happy to talk about it. In the meantime, by the way, I should say, this only works for books that make it to prominence. Lots of books just get silenced before they ever make it to market. But let's look a little bit at the Charlotte situation so we can talk about how this plays out in an even more nuanced way. So I want to go back to this historical moment and kind of paint the political picture for you a little bit. This is the moment of the economic New South, huge economic boom. Major corporations are leaving places like San Francisco and New York, coming to Charlotte. Nations Bank at the time was headquartered in Charlotte. Bank of America is going to merge with Nations Bank in 1998, so just a little bit after this. Huge growth in the area, as well as an influx of people from the coasts. This is also at the time of the AIDS epidemic. So symptoms were first described in 1981, and it was in 1987 that we get the first effective treatment. So this is the height of the AIDS epidemic. And Angels in America is a play about gay men grappling with the epidemic. So it's right in that historical moment. This is also the time of the Clinton-Bush-Perot election, 1992. So that election is interesting for a variety of reasons. President Clinton, at the time, candidate Clinton, actually attended the New York premiere of Angels in America a couple of days before the election, because I guess he was just chilling out. But then the other, I think, important moment here, which you may or may not remember, is Pat Buchanan's speech at the GOP nominating convention, which took place in Houston, in which he inaugurated what we now call the culture wars. So this is a speech where he says America is at war for its culture. And while these kinds of tensions had been bubbling in the United States for a while, that's when it became codified, and it became a political practice to discuss these things and bring them forward. Now, Buchanan did not win the nomination, right? Instead, we had Bush. We had George Bush at that moment. But nonetheless, his political approach was still very prominent, and we see that play out in a couple of other ways, particularly with North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms, who also pursued lots of political projects that were targeted at these controversies. So specifically, he offered to the Senate the AIDS Control Act, which was ultimately defeated, which did several things that I think by today's standards we consider very dangerous. So it would criminalize the donation of blood by gay men. So not like criminalize it, not like a fine or it has to be discarded, but to actually criminalize it. Also to take all people who are seropositive, who have the HIV virus, to release them from the armed forces, and to routinely screen all members of the American populace at routine health visits. So your primary care physician might screen you for HIV at a time when this could then have radical repercussions socially for you as well. And then he did actually succeed in attaching in 1987 to the budget, which became law, the Helms Amendment, which I think is a little notorious now because it restricted all CDC AIDS funding, it restricted the funding such that it could not be used for anything that was perceived as gay positive or sex positive. So this means, and I'm not interpreting here, it explicitly said that means it can only be used for programs aimed at abstinence outside of marriage and monogamous reproductive relationships within marriage. So that's clearly a cultural line, right? This is a law designed to draw a cultural line. It's also very devastating for, at the time, the AIDS community, because up until this moment, the people primarily involved in reducing the spread of the HIV virus were gay men. And this law says the CDC can't advise them to use condoms, for example, because it can't be seen as gay positive. It can't be affirming gay sex. So very, very restrictive. Angels, therefore, entering some very fraught political times. So what is the play itself? What's it doing? Well, it's humongous. It's massive. It is really two plays together. One is called Millennium Approaches. Of course, in 1992, the millennium was literally approaching. And the other is Perestroika, a callback to the Cold War and the notion of thawing. So the first one is sort of this like great danger is approaching, and the second is how do we overcome it? They're so long that they generally aren't performed together. And if they are, it's on separate nights. there was an HBO miniseries of 6 sequential 2-hour movies. That's how long they are together. So yeah, totally a good series. Lots of stars in it. Definitely worth watching. So the first full performance of all of them together is November 1992. It had been workshopped prior to that for a couple of years. So that's the moment that we're entering there. And then it is kind of a mess. Like people like it, but this is one of the classic quotations about this. Jonathan Friedman calls it a loose, baggy monster of a play, housing in its capacious representational tent inter alia Brechtian alienation devices, American mythologies, Broadway shtick, Kabbalistic folktales, sitcom wisecracks, and vaudeville blackout sketches. It is this very elusive, very dense, very silly, at very times almost melancholy, melodramatic play about gay men, as I said, grappling with AIDS. One of them is actually seropositive in it, and that comes up later in a second. But highly acclaimed. So the plays, when they premiered, among them won 12 Tony Awards, and that includes Best Play, but also Best Actor, and then a series of other Best Lighting, right? But also like, you know, Best Play. So the very, very important ones and the ones that are kind of niche. And then it also won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. And then even today, or more recently in 2018, 10 Tonys were given to it, including Best Play and Best Revival when it was brought back. Why is this important? Awards are defense against obscenity prosecutions because they certify the artistic value. So when you find a book that is controversial, you will 9 times out of 10 see the awards on the cover. And they're saying, you can't ban this book. Trust me, it has value. All right. So not controversial, hugely awarded, very popular in New York, had been workshopped in San Francisco. When it came time to bring this play out to the country to tour, as Broadway plays often do, there was some trepidation. So the costume designer for the touring company says, we were very aware that we were bringing a story and a set of political thinking to people who had not heard it. Who had not seen it represented, had not seen 2 boys kissing on stage or off. So there was a sense that it might be dangerous, that they were bringing a sensibility and a set of representations that were still controversial and still unfamiliar. That turned out to be not totally true. There were a little bit of a few protests around the country. So the Westboro Baptist Church did protest it, I believe, in Omaha. Kilgore, Texas, a town about the size of Lancaster, with a university, with a community college, did have a controversy in 1998. And the Catholic University in Washington, D.C. Did force the student production to move off-site, which was a little bit controversial at the time, but is really related to church doctrine. But I'm more interested, of course, I promised you, I would talk about what happened when it came to Charlotte, and that's actually where the biggest controversy erupted. But Charlotte, as you'll remember, was a town that was growing and experiencing a radical shift in its culture. So on the one hand, according to The Economist, nearly a quarter of the population had actually moved in by 1997 from outside the South, not just from outside Charlotte, but outside the South. And then the director of the Charlotte Repertory Theater, not of this play, but of others, said that Charlotte evinced a strange tension between an aspiration to be a world-class place and a very small-town way of thinking that's always been at the core, a Southern conservative church-going sensibility. Charlotte was divided in ways that perhaps it still is, still experiencing lots of different communities with different expectations, and the arts community was simply caught between these. So here's a little bit of a timeline. I hope you'll forgive me for getting a little into the weeds in how this all plays out. I think it helps us to understand that the series of consequences related to an obscenity controversy can be quite complex, and they shift over time. It becomes difficult to understand how it's working when you're in it. But with retrospect, we can see a little bit better. So Charlotte Repertory Theater decides to stage the play in 1996. They intend to air it in March. So they've been workshopping it. Nobody cares. It's just sort of happening, or nobody knows. But on March 18th, 2 days before it's set to premiere, Joe Chambers and his group, Concerned Charlotteans, protests at a Charlotte City Council meeting and says that the play is indecent, it shouldn't be performed, it challenges the values of the city and state, and therefore shouldn't be allowed to go on. Now, that evening and into the 19th, then his group files some legal briefs attempting to have the play stopped. The problem is because the play had all these awards and all these accolades, it couldn't be banned for obscenity. That was not going to work. So they decided instead to use Charlotte's indecent exposure law and target the fact that the play has about 8 seconds of nudity where one of the men living with HIV is in a doctor's office and he takes off his clothes. But it's a metaphor of being, laid bare and whatever. It's a metaphor, but it does involve nudity. And so they used this law, which is really about exotic dancers, to target the play. That issue, by the way, whether that law applies to artistic productions is still unresolved in Charlotte. Anyway, so they used that. CRT then goes back to the court and they say we want a temporary restraining order. We don't think this is indecent. We think it's artistic. Therefore, we need a restraining order to keep prosecutors, police, protesters from stopping the play. And the Blumenthal Performing Arts Center, which was the host to the Charlotte Repertory Theater at the time, because the Blumenthal had said, we're not sure if your contract allows you to do things that are illegal, and this might be illegal. So the Blumenthal said, we might have to shut you down. So the CRT actually got a restraining order against the Blumenthal, their own landlord at the time. Okay, however, the play was a huge hit. Remember I told you media attention? Well, this turned into a national scene. And so they actually sold more tickets than for any other show and had to extend the run for 10 shows. And then they had increased subscriptions for the following year. It was so popular that people were like, I need to support the Charlotte Repertory Theater. And there, anecdotally, I've heard accounts that the protesters against the play were outnumbered 3-1 by those in favor of the play. Essentially, it galvanized the arts community in Charlotte at the time. So that seems like that story of, we're getting increased attention, we're actually having increased sales. But then, of course, oh, and sorry, I probably shouldn't go through all of it. Yeah, I won't go through all of it. But this is backstage reporting on the controversy, and essentially says that the controversy was the publicist's dream because it drew national media. Tony Kushner actually decided he would come to Charlotte, whether they canceled the play or not. And the director's getting interviewed all over the place and all the media. And anyway, so this is sort of affirming that trajectory. But there's more to it, right? Everything doesn't end after the season ends and they pack up the stage. So in November of that year, conservatives are galvanized against what they saw as something that was inappropriate for their community. And the Mecklenburg County Board of Commissioners has an election in which they get an influx of new conservative members, including Bill James, who then continued to serve all the way through the 21st century. And this is when Jesse Helms is also on the ballot. So it's sort of a big wave election for them, and it's seen as a pushback against this presentation. People are sort of angry. They feel like CRT went too far, and so they push back. The Board of Commissioners then, there was a gang of 5, they were called, right? 4 Republicans, 4 conservatives who felt that this was inappropriate, and Hoyle Martin, who at the time was a Democrat who later ran as an independent. And his position was sort of informed by his religious background, and he felt the play was inappropriate too. So they teamed up and cut the funding for the Arts and Sciences Council to 0 from $2.5 million at the time. So there are repercussions, there are changes, right? It's not only that, these artworks become celebrated, they don't. However, then the following year in 1998, when there's another Board of Commissioners election, the gang of 4, all of them except for Bill James, get voted out. There's another pushback the other direction. And the Arts Council gets its funding reinstated. So where are we now after this back and forth? The Arts Council is still very strong. The Arts Council, I was just saying, it was funny to me that they promoted this event, the Arts and Science Council. Hooray, thank you, or if you're here. But Charlotte Rep is also closed. Does that have to do with this? It's not entirely clear, but there is declining support for theater, which may be a result of that as well. And then people also blame the economic downturn after 9/11 and a host of other things. CRT just couldn't make it work. So it closed probably as part of this whole process, but it's unclear. Okay, what can we take away from this? What are the lessons from this particular incident? First, culture wars are often national. They tend to happen across these large swaths of people. They attract national attention, but the way these things play out is highly, highly local. Remember that I said that what happened in Charlotte is really a result of Charlotte's economic experience at that moment, and political culture, and migration, internal migration in the country at that time. And it played out according even to whether the local senator was on the ballot, right? Because Jesse Helms was on the ballot in 1996, but he was not on the ballot in 1998 when the people who were swept in with him are then swept back out. So it really has this very particular hyper-local character to it. But that attracts national attention too. Local controversies become national controversies. That's as true now, if not more, in the age of social media than it was then in the age of legacy media before the internet. Because of course, the internet changes everything. The book only goes up to like 1996 because then everything is different with the birth of the internet. All right, let me see if I can offer some bigger takeaways from the book at large. First, censorship politics are both national and local. And it's a recursive process. It's very hard to pin down without looking deeply into the historical context. Some of the impacts of censorship are surprising, tends to lead to increased attention, not decreased attention. But others are predictable. People who are already in positions of relative ease tend to have those positions affirmed. People who are already on the outs tend to have those positions affirmed as well by these processes. And the big takeaway, I think, is that censorship in the United States doesn't produce silence. It produces controversy, which is something very different. All right, thanks. Thanks for bearing with me. It's something that I think a lot about. All right, I think I'm happy to take questions.